Hello, I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. Joining me today is Mirella Stoyanova, a Seattle-based writer and therapist and international adoptee from Bulgaria of, I believe, Bulgarian and Iraqi origin. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. I'm so excited to be here.
So I'd like to start with earlier this year, you had an article published in Business Insider. The title was "I was adopted as a child by an American family. They still can't pronounce my name correctly." So can you tell us a little bit about that and how um, this story, from what I've understand, is part of kind of a larger um, narrative, a story that you are writing and reclaiming in an upcoming memoir. So.
Certainly. Yeah. The article itself, I was inspired by a recent trip I took with my family. And on that trip, um, as a family, were sitting around the table, and um, a topic that often comes up is how to say my name, how to pronounce it correctly. And I realized that this year happened to be um, 18 years of me asking my family to pronounce my name correctly. And I am 36, so that happens to be half of my life. And so I wrote the piece in part to give myself an outlet for, I think, what was honest exasperation, but also to draw attention to dynamics that might otherwise go unseen within the adoptee experience, and particularly the cross-cultural adoptee experience.
That's great. And from what I from the article, and people could check out, have a link to it. You you do go to a lot of effort to help folks pronounce your name correctly. I think you like mirror as in um, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I related to that a bit. My name is frequently mispronounced, despite uh, all efforts, and I will like go through, Stephen, like Stephen Colbert, or when I was much younger, Stephen King was the one. It never worked, so it can be
Yeah.
frustrating, I imagine, right? So,
It
um,
is. And I think culture and, appearances play a part of that. I imagine that maybe that's been a part of your experience too, is that you see a complicated name, or maybe not a complicated name in your case, and then you look at who that name belongs to, and judgments are made or not. And perhaps we're not as sensitive, but I think that names are a reflection of identity. And within a family context, when we're talking about saying a name right, we're talking about, the ability to see someone for who they are, not who you want them to be.
and you talked about sort of reclaiming your name, because I think the last name you're using is not one you'd always use. That you had sort of, as you said, reclaimed.
Yeah, it's an interesting story because I'm adopted, and I apologize, there's some noise in the background. I'm adopted from Bulgaria, and Stoyanova is a name that belonged to my family, my birth family. And when I got married almost 3 years ago, I was really reluctant to change my name. I sort of went through that, like, patriarchal society. And of course, now with everything going on in the news, it's hard to ignore like the implications of a name change. But having already been adopted and changed my name once, I was really reluctant to do it again. And when I did change my name, I started to think about how I could honor the complexity of my identity. And a part of that was reclaiming the name I had prior to my adoption. And funny enough, when I went to go file the paperwork came in and it was second time at the Social Security office, which I don't recommend going to change your name twice in 1 year. And I ended up going to the courthouse on the anniversary of my arrival to the United States by 30 years to reclaim my name. And so, it's not often people will stand up and say what that moment in their life symbolizes, but I did. I stood up and I told the judge, this actually happens to be the 30th anniversary of my arrival to the United States, and I am reclaiming a part of my identity that's significant to me.
And so you were very young when you came to the States, and was adopted. But from things I've read of you do seem to have some memory of the time, or is that? Could you speak a bit about that?
Yeah. So I came to the United States in 1993 from Bulgaria. I was 5 years old. And so I do remember quite a lot, in part because when you make a shift like that, and when you make a large transition, I think, at least for me, I held on to those memories in order to cope with the the difficulty of transitioning to a new family, new language, new culture, everything. And a year and a half before, what precipitated the adoption was I had witnessed the murder suicide of my birth parents at age 3, and was being cared for by my grandmother, who lived in our home with us. And she happened to be dying of cancer and had to find a way forward for me that she would not be a part of. And so, you can imagine 1989 was the fall of the Soviet Union in Bulgaria. And there'd been, I think that year, an attempt to expel the Turkish minority from the country. And it had failed, but there was still a lot of Islamophobia and racial prejudice against people who were dark. And there also, I think, has been for a long time. And my grandmother had this, this little girl with an afro and big eyebrows, and she had to figure out what was going to happen to her. And so she went through a period of months trying to figure it out, and eventually chose an American family for me to be adopted into a year and a half after my parents died. And so I came to the United States. I was raised in a white family community about 35 minutes outside of Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Which, for people, I think most people will know, Seattle's, I wouldn't say notoriously white, but
Right.
not.
And in the 90s, it was even whiter.
Yeah. I remember the film Singles in college. That was my entry to Seattle. And so, and I think because you touched upon this with your afro, young as a child. And so for folks who might not get kind of the racial dynamics of where you were to where you came. So can you speak a bit about Bulgaria and because people might have their own expectations of what the racial dynamics of the former Soviet Union might have been?
I think, in the United States, we think and talk about race in terms of, and rightfully so, in terms of the legacy of slavery. And the thing that is often not on our radar is that there are colonized people all over the world, right? Or maybe it's on our radar, but we don't, think about prejudice on a global scale. And in Bulgaria, as in many places in Europe, there exists, racial prejudice across lines that are drawn differently. And so, in Bulgaria, I might not even be considered Bulgarian. I might be considered an outsider. And in the times that I've visited, um, I am not claimed by that culture, although I claim it myself. So yeah, it's a complicated identity, but it's one that, for me, I've worked hard to claim for myself.
Uh, and so what was it like growing up in Seattle and with a white family? And for those who are listening and not watching, so who can't see you and make presumptions, not that anyone should make presumptions, but what
Sure.
was your experience like?
Yeah.
Growing
Well, the first thing I would say is that I didn't know really anything about my Middle Eastern heritage. What I knew was framed by what I understood of the story behind why my parents died. And my parents, as I said, it was a murder suicide, and the dominant narrative was that my birth father's motivations in killing my birth mother were culturally influenced, religiously influenced, which, as I've done more and more work over time to understand for myself what actually happened and how I relate to what happened, and how I forged my own cultural and ethnic identity, I've come to see that the the narrative, well, the truth of what happened was actually far more complex. So that framed my cultural identity or lack thereof, which for the most part involved trying to blend in as much as I could in order to fit in, because I believed that anything that made me different um, was going to um, be a barrier to essentially my like happiness, my well-being. And so I straightened my hair. I went with friends to the tanning salon, even though I was already tan. I didn't say where I was from at school when people asked, or I would sort of um, I had my sort of catchphrases of like, I don't actually really know, or there's a lot of obscurity on that side of the family. And as a result, I didn't form a really cohesive understanding of who I was as a whole person until much, much later. I mean, I would say in my early adulthood, even I started trying to understand on an academic level. And it wasn't until I did a lot more personal work in the years that followed that I was really able to integrate all of those parts of who I am and understand my connection to my cultural heritage, um, with a deeper appreciation for the ways that my traumatic experiences sort of fractured that understanding.
and you've since gone back. Can you speak a bit about what that experience was like? Like, sort of, obviously, it's your home, but not your home in certain ways because you'd been away for so long. Like, so what was it like the first time you returned? Obviously, the government and the
Yeah.
political climate had changed dramatically.
Yeah, there's still a lot of fear because at least on my Bulgarian side, and my grandmother at that point had died. She died a month to the day after I arrived to the United States. But the individuals that had sort of supported me to come over to the United States, the people who aided in my adoption were still present. And there was a lot of fear that actually my paternal family would find out where I was, because what we later learned was that there had been adoption proceedings on my birth family's side that had been thwarted intentionally by my grandmother and the people who had helped her in order to ensure my safe arrival to the United States.
Hmm.
So going back, the first time I went back, to answer your question, I was 10, and it was a positive experience overall and emotional, and I was given certain bits of information that I think helped me integrate my own understanding of my past with developmentally appropriate sort of inclusions of how do I want to say this, like just things about who I was that I could understand better at the age that I was. And then I actually went back a second time, and I'm overdue for a third visit by quite a bit. But I went back when I was 20, the summer, after a summer study abroad program when I was in college. I was learning Arabic. I studied Arabic, and it was my third year condensed into a summer of Arabic study. And after I completed that, I flew to Bulgaria, where I asked some really pointed questions of the people who I was connected to at the time in order to better understand what had happened. And it was at that time that I learned some of the backstory that complicated the narrative of my parents' deaths and helped me to better integrate both my own cultural understanding, but also the questions I had about what had happened previously.
And it's just so interesting that you sort of maintain that you don't. There's certain stories and narratives of folks who kind of, I don't say reject. Everyone has their own choices of what they do, but
Yeah,
feel
certainly.
All that matters is, especially let's say, is I'm American. I was born an American, or rather, I grew up as an American, and that's my identity. And they sort of cling to that for many
Yeah.
reasons that I'm not getting into, but from what I'm hearing from you and whatever, there's certainly pressures to do that, right? With living in America, because it is obviously easier. Can you sort of speak to that and sort of choices as to you had as to whether you were kind of, maybe it's easier to just be an American and not go into my past, or,
Yeah.
especially in Seattle?
Well, I think a lot of that was a pressure that I felt in my upbringing to conform to as many conventions as I could. And, I think about the zeitgeist at that time was, Abercrombie and Fitch. I'm not sure if you watched that documentary. It made me just boil. It made my blood boil to watch it. Because what we're talking about is like the marketing and advertising of like white supremacy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't be a white girl on the plateau in Sammamish, Washington, which is the sort of the place where I grew up. I no matter how many fancy clothes I got, I saved up for, no matter, how well my hair was straightened, I couldn't fit in because I was different. And I think for me, that struggle to fit in, to find belonging, it led to a lot of relational breakdown. And what I mean by that is I had so much trouble being myself because I had no clue who I was, right?
Mhm.
I was constantly trying to fit into this mold that, you know, wasn't who I was at my core, right? And so that obscured even just like the understanding that um I had to accept myself. And so for many, many years, I had trouble feeling grounded in who I was and even understanding that.
Yeah, and I know because America's known as sort of the myth of it, or an idealized version of sort of the melting pot and all these cultures coming together. But often
Yeah.
it's, it is a family unit that travels, or sort of, and you have the culture of, even as you kind of assimilate or kind of go about in America, you're part of sort of either the Italian Americans. Even my experience, like I have memories, even
Yeah.
in 1980s, Greenville, South Carolina, of being, from the Black church and whatever, of a part of this community where there are people like me, and I'm different in any sort of ways, as people know. I'm very different, but at least in that sense, superficially, I kind of fit in, right? So it's tough when that's not the case, and I know that brings up the kind of very complicated discussions about transracial adoption,
Yeah.
or adoption. Um, it's not always that, you don't want to make it a political thing. Like, like people had criticized Amy Coney Barrett's families and so forth, and arguments at that, because sometimes it's you're adopting someone from a different culture to essentially crush that culture, because the goal is like to no longer be part of what you were. You're now part of this, even though you can't really fit in.
Yeah.
So uh, what is the sense of that? Is there kind of, and obviously you love your family, you're whatever. Is there a sense of, with placement and of families? And again, I've read this a lot. It's sort of like, does it create challenges of where could there be more intentionality, or like where you're going to send someone? Like if you're going to send them to
Yeah.
a very racially undiverse place compared to other parts of the country that might be like, what are your thoughts? I know it's such a
I
fraught
have
topic.
so many thoughts. We could talk for an hour alone on this topic, but what you're talking about is socialization, right? And the way that someone who is transracially adopted is socialized according to the racial background of that family and not necessarily their cultural, ethnic, racial background. And that creates problems and confusion and lapses in an ability to recognize that how I move through the world isn't the same way that my family moves through the world, right? And actually, before I became a therapist, I worked in child welfare. I'm a social worker by trade, um, or by training, and a therapist by trade, I suppose. I think that's right. Um, and so I did a lot of work around um, promoting understanding of those cultural differences. And I think as a community, adoptions, those in the adoption triad, meaning birth family, adoptive family, adoptees, I think we are working to develop some degree of understanding about the cultural losses that occur for an adoptee. And I think that adult adoptees right now are really central in promoting that understanding. There's been never before has there been such a vocal cohort of adult adoptees doing advocacy work around cross-cultural adoption. But I do think that, like if you speak with those who are doing this work now, many of them will say that an ideal solution would be not to have adoption at all, right? There's like an abolitionist sort of element to it.
Hmm.
Um, but but I think what personally where I fall is I think that we need to prioritize the the family, the community, right? The look like the culture of that child and making decisions about where they receive care. If they
Hmm.
are if they are orphaned or if they are truly adoptable. And right now, there's growing awareness that in much of the world, many of the children that are made adoptable through coercive practices because maybe that family is impoverished, maybe they're not getting the support, maybe there isn't the infrastructure to keep families together. And so that has huge implications for where we go as a society, but it also relates very deeply to how we approach adoption cross culturally within the United States.
Yeah, and I'm someone who I'm not particularly an extremist on topics, and I'm all about nuance, and I believe that I've been reading a lot about this topic as well, and yeah, it is frustrating. It's frustrating sometimes when you'll see the parent who's like, I just adopted a black child, and I'm going to sit down and let's see who says Harriet Tubman, and I'm like, okay, well, if you're at this point where it's like, who are black people who exist beyond Denzel Washington and Martin Luther King, that might be a challenge as opposed to there are people who are, kind of versed in the culture. I would imagine it'd be the same, like say after World War II and Jewish, children, there are families who
Yeah.
perfectly well meaning, but like my family, you would have been raised as a Christian and
Mm-hmm.
any connect forget any sort of even the ability to sort of reproduce certain cultural touchstones there would have been
Yeah.
removed, and not out of you know um bigotry, but just that's just not their culture, whereas upon
Right.
and so um I do think that there are people who are perhaps better equipped, like I think it was one Seattle author, and forgive me, I'm blanking on her name, but she'd written uh if your child is your first black friend, perhaps you should reconsider adopting a black child.
Absolutely. Was
Yeah.
it Angela Tucker? Is the
No, and again, it'll be one of those I'll drop in. Forgive my
yeah.
middle-aged brain, but I'll drop it in the the comments later when I edit this. So be me from the future,
Cool.
remembering who this author was. Um, but yes, I mean, I think there are certain ways, as you say, to sort of be helpful for the person's kind of growth and to be ability to thrive as
Yeah.
themselves in the world.
And an added complicating factor in my case is that Arabs are not considered a separate ethnic category within the United States Census. So for a long time, I was like, what am I? Like I'm not white, but where I fit in terms of categories of race and ethnicity isn't doesn't neatly fit into a box.
Oh yeah.
And Arabs aren't there. If you, even today, if you go on a census form, you are not, there's no Middle Eastern um, option. It's white. And
Mhm.
that is not who I am. And
Yeah.
while I I am also half Bulgarian and light skinned. How I walk through the world is as a multicultural person.
Mhm. Well, white is a very political term. Like black exists because,
Mhm.
as Richard Pryor
Right.
famously said, they took
Right.
every different tribe and made one tribe black. He used
And
a more he used a more potent term there, but and
yeah,
for white, we don't. There's you're from this country or that, you're French, you're
right.
Italian, whatever. But white has a very sort of political meaning. And so to me, that seems, especially the period where you're growing up, as a
Yeah.
child, I think barely 10, or when 9/11 occurs.
A
Um,
month before my 13th birthday.
yeah.
Yeah.
So for a child in that to have the state that's someone who's of this background is white makes
Yeah.
no political sense because um, people from that background really, and I think of the past few decades, it has been such an othering experience if you're from that background. So,
Yeah.
yeah, what are some of your thoughts on that? Like that, because that seems strange to me as well.
How do you even honor an identity if that identity isn't acknowledged on a broad scale? Right? Like,
Mhm.
how would I even know, growing up, that what it means? And for me, I had more incentive to just try to blend in and sort of make myself racially ambiguous. And that leads to so much confusion.
Yeah, well, especially around a period where groups who sort of look like, so people who look like you, so
Right.
black people again have the jokes about, oh my God, please don't
Yeah.
let this criminal be black because I've got to deal with it. And so at the
And there's a
time,
dual
period.
consciousness. There's a
Mhm.
dual, excuse me, there's a dual consciousness of, how I walk through the world is this sort of singular, particular experience. And what I'm being told about myself from my family is very different from the experience that I'm having in the world. And for a long time, it was sort of like, Mirella, you're being too sensitive. Mirella, you're being too sensitive. Mirella, they're just paying attention to you because, they think you're beautiful, which I won't even get into that. But it makes it very difficult to understand what the truth is.
Mhm.
And of course, the truth is broader and more complicated than a dominant narrative.
Well, and whiteness can be extended to a point, right? So
There
there
are
are
limits.
ways, there are limits, and so I think what happens is kind of just like, I've waved my wand, you're white, and let's never think about it again. And it's like it's not that easy, even if you were to want to do so. And again, I don't question anyone's choice, but even if you were want to do so, there's limits to the extent that you can. Um, you are a therapist. The time I have left, I'm curious because you're working on this memoir about your life, which is anyone's listening is very fascinating, and people should want to read about it as you work on it. So, how part of that professional background of yours, how is that sort of informing how you approach the sort of the story of your life, like
Yeah.
for a therapeutic lens,
Well,
perhaps?
from a therapeutic lens, I think my being a writer, and by the way, the memoir is complete. I am in the process of searching for literary representation. But I've been working on this memoir for a few years now. And I would say that writing in general is one of the most it's one of the highest expressions of the healing journey that I've been on, and learning to define myself by something other than the traumas that I've been through. And I wrote this book to create space for understanding, first for myself about something that was somewhat confusing to me. And now I'm working on hopefully seeing this book make its way into the world to create that space for understanding for others. So what I have kind of like a long spiel and a short spiel, but the long spiel is I was engaged to be married in December 2020, so like I don't know, 6 months into the pandemic. And rather than being the exciting event that I think everyone envisions, I was extremely destabilized and full of rage. And while I had some understanding, I didn't know why. And so to really understand and overcome my ambivalence to marriage, I had to reckon with my past traumas in not one but two families of origin. So my birth family and my adoptive family. And the book is about it's about a lot of things, but essentially it's about how trauma fractures identity. It's about the lifelong effects of unresolved grief. And it's about how we can heal as a society by choosing to heal ourselves.
Wonderful. Yes, I think we had talked about this. I knew you were working on it, and I'm so happy that you've completed it. And people
Thank
should.
you.
It's such a great story. It's so relevant. So, if
Thank
you
you.
are someone who would want to publish this, you should, and listening, you should reach out to Mirella. Um, yeah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing a bit of your story with me. It's again, it's so engaging and such a interesting experience that you've had in America, in Seattle. Where can folks find you if they want to read more of your work or learn more about you?
Yeah, my Instagram handle is a great place. I often post writing updates there. It's at Mirella Stoyanova, MirelllaStoyanova. Or you can find me on my website, mirellastoyanova.com. And I don't post updates there and I don't have a newsletter, but I do have a mailing list that I plan to use once I have some substantive updates to offer. I don't want to spam people, so I'm sort of waiting on that.
No, that's very generous of you. Thank you again. Thanks, folks, for listening and on watching. Like, share, subscribe at the Play Typer Guy, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.